On Christmas Day, 1950, a 16-year-old girl stood at the edge of the Imjin River and watched the ice crack beneath her brother-in-law's feet. He was holding his son. The boy was screaming. The frozen surface had shattered under the weight of thousands of refugees all trying to cross at once, and the two of them were sinking into water so cold it could stop a heart in minutes. People behind her were shouting, pulling her back, telling her she was too heavy, that if she jumped, she would break the ice further and no one would make it across. She jumped anyway. She fell. She grabbed the boy by the string of his winter hat and pulled, choking him as she dragged him upward, and she held on until an American soldier ran over and helped her haul both the child and his father out of the river. Her name was Helen Kyungsook Daniels. She had been walking for 20 days. She had a child strapped to her back that was not her own. And she still had 8 more days of walking ahead of her before she would reach anything resembling safety. Her story was not recorded for more than 50 years. When it finally was, it was not a journalist who found her, but a psychologist, Professor Ramsay Liem of Boston College, who spent nearly 5 hours interviewing her for the Korean-American Memories of the Korean War Oral History Project. Her testimony was later published in the Amerasia Journal in 2005. By then, she was an elderly woman living quietly in Petaluma, California, and almost no one in her life, not her children, not her neighbors, knew what she had survived. To understand how a 16-year-old girl ended up walking for 28 consecutive days through a frozen war zone carrying a child on her back, you need to understand what was happening on the Korean peninsula in the winter of 1950 and why approximately 5.8 million Koreans, 1 in every 5 people on the peninsula, became refugees. The Korean War had begun on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the south. Within 3 days, Seoul had fallen. The United Nations, led by the United States, intervened. By September, General Douglas MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon reversed the tide. UN forces pushed north, recaptured Seoul, took Pyongyang, and by late November were approaching the Chinese border at the Yalu River. MacArthur promised his troops they would be home by Christmas. He was catastrophically wrong. On November 25, 1950, approximately 200,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu River into North Korea. The intervention was massive, sudden, and devastating. Within weeks, UN forces were in full retreat. The United States Army began what military historians would later call the longest retreat in American military history. 120 miles down the Korean peninsula, with Chinese forces attacking retreating convoys, ambushing vehicles, and launching bayonet charges on soldiers clinging to the sides of trucks. By early December, the order came to abandon Pyongyang. The capital of North Korea, which UN forces had held for barely 6 weeks, was to be evacuated. And with the soldiers went the civilians. According to a U.S. State Department telegram from the American Embassy in Seoul, declassified and preserved in the Foreign Relations of the United States Archives, an estimated 500,000 civilians were on the move southward following the fall of Pyongyang. Approximately 200,000 managed to cross into South Korean-controlled territory from the west. Another 130,000 were evacuated by sea from the northeastern port of Hangnam. But the rest, hundreds of thousands more, were left behind. Those who made it walked. Helen Kyungsook Daniels was born in Manchuria, in northeastern China, where her parents had migrated from Korea during the Japanese colonial period. Her father, she later told Professor Liem, had left Korea because the country was devastated by years of drought and there was no food. He bought a farm in Manchuria, and according to Helen, worked as a middleman for the Korean independence movement, transporting rice across the border into North Korea as cover for passing information and money to resistance networks that were funding weapons and supplies. Helen's mother did not know the details. In those days, Helen explained, men did not tell their wives what they were doing because the Japanese could come and beat the wife until she revealed everything. One rainy day, Helen's father told her mother he was going out to check the rice paddies because there was a problem with the water draining off. He took one of the farm workers and walked out with an umbrella. That same dark afternoon, Japanese and Korean policemen arrived at the house and asked Helen's mother where her husband was. She told them. That was the last anyone saw of him. They never found his body. Helen's mother raised 10 children alone. Only 5 survived. She sold single bowls of rice, washed clothes for others, and sewed to keep them alive. When the Japanese surrendered in 1945 and the war between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong intensified, the family could no longer stay in Manchuria. Chinese civilians were killing Koreans in retaliation for Koreans who had been used by the Japanese to carry out their policies. The family fled to Pyongyang in 1946. Helen was 12. For 4 years, the family lived under the new communist government of North Korea. School was free. Uniforms were provided. Books were given to every student. Helen's mother worked as a cook at a college. For a family that had known nothing but poverty, the system offered a kind of stability they had never experienced before. Helen had just finished junior high school when the war broke out. By December 1950, the Chinese counteroffensive had reached the outskirts of Pyongyang. Helen's brother-in-law gathered the family and said they had to leave. On December 5th, 1950, the same day that Associated Press photographer Max Desfour captured his Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of thousands of refugees climbing across the bombed-out skeleton of the Taedong River Bridge in Pyongyang, Helen, her older sister, her brother-in-law, their 3 children, and the brother-in-law's mother left the city on foot. Helen was 16 years old. They put one child on her back. Her sister carried a newborn baby. Her brother-in-law carried a 4-year-old. They thought they were leaving for a few days just to escape the bombing and that they would return. There was one person who did not come with them. Helen's younger sister wanted to join them, but the brother-in-law's other relative, Helen's sister-in-law, was pulling the younger girl by the arm, insisting she stay behind because the sister-in-law was afraid to be left alone. At the same time, Helen's brother-in-law was dragging Helen in the opposite direction because he needed her to carry one of the children. Helen and her older sister were crying. They did not want to separate from the younger sister. But the sister-in-law kept saying they would all be back in a few days. They never came back. Helen later learned that her mother, her younger sister, and her sister-in-law were all killed by bombing. She carried the knowledge of that separation. The moment her brother-in-law pulled her away from her younger sister, for almost 40 years before she ever spoke about it. The walk south began immediately. Pyongyang was a ghost town. When they reached the Taedong River, there was a single canoe to carry people across. But there were far too many refugees for the small boat. It filled with so many people that water started coming in over the sides. Refugees began pushing each other, breaking through the ice at the river's edges. People were screaming. Everyone got soaked. In early December in North Korea, temperatures routinely drop well below freezing. Being soaked in those conditions was not discomfort. It was a death sentence if you could not find shelter. Every day followed the same pattern. They woke at 6 in the morning and walked until it was dark. Then they would try to find an abandoned village to sleep in. The villages closest to the main roads had already been stripped of food by the refugees who passed through before them. Only the villages farther off the road still had anything left to eat. And then there was the baby. Helen's sister's newborn cried constantly. In a war zone, a crying baby is not merely a source of stress. It is a signal. It tells anyone within earshot, soldiers, patrols, enemy forces, exactly where you are. Helen's brother-in-law's mother understood this with brutal clarity. She began insisting that they had to abandon the baby. She said the crying was too loud, that it would attract communists or soldiers who would find them and kill them all. Helen's sister wept. She would not give up her child. The tension between the grandmother's survival logic and the mother's refusal to abandon her newborn played out day after day as they walked through the frozen countryside. This was not an isolated dilemma. Across the Korean peninsula, in the winter of 1950 and 1951, the same terrible calculation was being made by refugee families everywhere. According to testimonies collected by the Liberty in North Korea organization and multiple oral history projects, there were documented cases of refugee groups being discovered and captured because of a crying baby. The grandmother's fear was not irrational. The mother's refusal was not naive. Both were acting from the deepest impulses a human being can have, the drive to survive and the drive to protect one's child. And those impulses were in direct, irreconcilable conflict. The crisis resolved itself not through compromise, but through geography. Just before the group reached Kaesong, the town near the 38th parallel that divides North and South Korea, the grandmother found a friend nearby and decided to stay behind. For the first time since they left Pyongyang, the group was smaller. 6 people, 2 adults, 1 teenager, 3 children. And the baby was still with them. They walked on. The roads were packed with thousands of refugees moving in the same direction. Helen carried the boy on her back. He urinated on her constantly. She described the sensation to Professor Liem with startling honesty. The sudden warmth running down her back, the humiliation, the rage. She carried a walking cane and tried to hit the boy, telling him to stop. But the crowd was so dense that when she swung the cane, she struck the people walking directly behind her. They yelled at her. There was no room to stop, no space to adjust. The crowd moved as a single mass, and if you stopped, you were trampled or cursed at. The pressure to keep moving was relentless. Then came Christmas Day, the Imjin River, American soldiers, Korean soldiers, and South Korean women. Police were all stationed at the crossing, armed, blocking the refugees from crossing. The reason was infiltration. North Korean soldiers had been disguising themselves as refugees to slip behind UN lines. The military could not distinguish civilians from combatants, so they blocked everyone. The refugees refused to accept it. Hundreds of voices rose in protest. People shouted that they had walked for weeks, that they had nowhere to go back to, that their homes no longer existed. And then someone in the crowd shouted what everyone was thinking. Either we die here, or we die crossing. The crowd surged forward onto the ice. The ice broke. There were too many people. Helen's brother-in-law and his son fell through. This is the moment that would define the rest of Helen's life, not because of what happened, but because of what she chose. People behind her grabbed her, pulling her back, shouting that her weight would break more ice and prevent anyone else from crossing. She did not listen. She jumped forward, fell onto the fractured ice, reached into the water, grabbed the string of her nephew's winter hat, and pulled. The boy was choking because the string tightened around his throat as she dragged him upward. An American GI ran to her and helped pull both the boy and his father out of the freezing water. After the crossing, soldiers searched every refugee for weapons, patting down their bodies in the freezing cold. Then the group pressed on to Yeongdeungpo, where they found boxcar trains heading south. They climbed onto the top of the freight cars. There was no room inside, and sat on the edges for 3 days as the train lurched toward Daejeon. When the train stopped and started, it jerked violently. People fell off the cars and died. Helen's brother-in-law tied the family to the top of the car with rope so they could not fall, even if they wanted to move. They reached Daejeon and stayed for 5 days. Then they were told to move again. Another train took them to Airi, a small town in the south. They were placed in a refugee camp. They would stay there for 3 years, 28 days, from Pyongyang to Iri. Through ghost towns and frozen rivers, past soldiers with guns pointed at them, on top of trains where people died from the jerking of the cars. A 16-year-old girl who had already lost her father to the Japanese occupation, who was in the process of losing her mother and younger sister to American bombing, who carried a child that was not hers because her brother-in-law needed her body as a vehicle for his son's survival. Helen Kyungsook Daniels was not unique. That is perhaps the most devastating part of her story. According to records preserved by the National Archives of Korea and the Provisional Capital Memorial Hall in Busan by March 1951, there were 878 refugees from Seoul alone registered in Busan, plus an additional 33, 891 from North Korea. These numbers represent only those who were officially counted. The actual number of displaced people who walked south during the winter of 1950 and 1951 was far higher. The main roads were controlled by UN forces, so refugees detoured to secondary roads and mountain trails. Many froze to death, particularly during the January 4th retreat of 1951, when Seoul fell to the Chinese for the second time, and another 260,000 refugees poured into Busan. The Korean War killed or wounded at least 3 million Koreans. It divided 10 million families. As of the most recent data available, more than 75,000 applicants for family reunions between North and South Korea have died without ever seeing their relatives again. The reunions, when they happen at all, are limited to a handful of families selected by lottery from tens of thousands of applicants, most of whom are now in their 80s and 90s. But what happened to Helen after the war is, in some ways, as revealing as the war itself. She eventually married an American serviceman. She moved to the United States. She settled in Petaluma, California. And she did not talk about what happened. Not to her husband, not to her children, not to anyone. For decades. This silence was not unique to Helen. Professor Ramsay Liem, who directed the Korean-American Memories of the Korean War Oral History Project at Boston College, documented a systematic pattern of silencing among Korean War survivors in the United States. In his academic work, published in Peace and Conflict, Journal of Peace Psychology in 2007, he analyzed how Cold War geopolitics, the stigma of having relatives in North Korea, and the pressure to assimilate into American life combined to create what he described as a politics of silence that relegated survivor accounts to the margins of history. Korean Americans who had lived through the war rarely spoke about it. Not because they had forgotten, but because speaking carried risks. Having family in the North could mark you as suspect. Expressing grief over what happened could be interpreted as political sympathy with the wrong side. The war itself was labeled by Americans as the forgotten war, and that forgetting was not accidental. It was structural. Helen's silence took a specific embodied form that she did not recognize for what it was until she began speaking to Professor Liem. When her children were growing up, she told him, she had a compulsion she could not explain. Every time a neighbor's child came to her house, she would feed them, not just offer a snack. She would insist, repeatedly, urgently, pressing cookies and food into their hands, telling them to eat more, have more, take more. When the children left, she would follow them to the door, still offering food. Her daughter assumed this was simply a Korean cultural trait, that all Korean mothers were like this. But sitting in front of a tape recorder for the first time in her life, telling the story of walking for 28 days through a country where there was nothing to eat, where they slept in ghost towns stripped of food, where the villages close to the main road had already been emptied by the refugees who came before them, Helen made a connection she had never articulated before. The compulsion to feed every child who entered her home was not cultural. It was the war. The hunger had never left her body. It had simply changed form. For 50 years, every time she saw a child, her nervous system responded to a threat that no longer existed. The threat that this child, like her, might not eat again. This is what trauma does when it is never spoken. It does not disappear. It finds another language. It becomes a behavior pattern so deeply embedded that the person performing it cannot see it. Helen's daughter grew up watching her mother feed every child in the neighborhood and interpreted it as love, which it was. But it was also grief and fear. And a 16-year-old girl still standing in a frozen village in 1950, realizing that the people who arrived first had already eaten everything. The Korean War has been over for more than 70 years. No peace treaty has ever been signed. The two Koreas remain technically at war, separated by the most heavily militarized border on Earth. The families that were divided in 1950 and 1951, the 10 million people who lost contact with parents, children, siblings, have mostly died without reunion. The memories of those who survived have largely gone unrecorded. Professor Liem's oral history project, which eventually collected 36 testimonies from Korean Americans in the Boston and San Francisco areas, represents one of the very few systematic efforts to preserve these stories before the last survivors are gone. Helen Kyungsook Daniels told Professor Liem something near the end of her interview that captures the weight of everything she carried. Not just the child on her back, but the decades of silence afterward. She said she sometimes lies in bed at night, unable to sleep, and thinks about whether her life would have been different if she had made different choices. But then she catches herself. There were no choices. There was no guidance, no education, no one to help. Just survival, daily. You make breakfast, she said, but you do not know if you are going to have dinner. She was born in Manchuria because her parents fled a Korea that had been colonized by Japan. Her father was killed by the Japanese because he supported Korean independence. She returned to Korea and found it divided by powers that had nothing to do with Korean self-determination. She fled a war that was started by Koreans but fueled by the Cold War ambitions of China, the Soviet Union, and the United States. She crossed a frozen river on Christmas Day while American soldiers pointed guns at her. She was saved by an American GI who helped her pull a drowning child from the ice. She married an American. She moved to America. She fed American children from her kitchen for 50 years because a war that America calls forgotten had written itself into her muscles, her reflexes, her hands reaching for one more cookie to press into one more small palm. On December 5, 1950, a 16-year-old girl left Pyongyang with a child on her back, thinking she would return in a few days. She walked for 28 days. She never went back. And for half a century, she carried that walk in silence. Not on her back anymore, but in every plate of food she placed in front of a child who was not her own, in a country that had already forgotten why she could not stop.